Hi, I'm Urmi Desai, and this is the Moose Smartly Show. Our segment today is our popular consumer Q&A, The Situation, where I ask my co-host John Pasalis of Realosophy Realty in Toronto to respond to the many questions we get from you over social media and email about your various real estate situations across the GTA. If you would like to have your own questions answered or considered for a future show, please email us at askjohn@moosesmartly.com. That link is in the show notes. We do change a reminder that we do change some names for privacy and edit a few details, minor ones for clarity, but these are real questions that we get from consumers every day. And John, I understand that you are noticing a pretty big trend with the kind of questions you're getting lately.
Yeah, definitely. Over the past, I'd say over the past month, I've been getting a fair number of questions of effectively people's problems, like people who are sort of in the middle of a transaction, things went wrong and they need help. And this is, I mean, it's a challenge for a couple of reasons. I mean, number one, we record this segment once a month, so by the time we answer it, it's a little bit too late, even if we keep it general. But more importantly, I can't, you know, I feel bad because people reach out asking for help, but I can't really help. I can't really interfere with someone else's transaction, especially obviously if they're working with another agent. Like it's not generally something that I can do. And I think this is like a very good reminder why I think it's very important for people to really, invest some time before they start working with somebody to represent them with their home sale or their home purchase. I know people generally invest little time. They so and so's friend is a real estate agent. It's all fine. They just open the lockbox. They don't do much. Is some people's sentiment. But obviously, these are very big transactions when someone's buying or selling a home. So you want to interview. I always recommend. I mean, if you even know a real estate agent, I mean, it should not be assumed that someone's gonna hire them or you're gonna hire them. It's always good to interview two or three people because I mean, a big part of this business, of course, is you know us doing whatever we can to mitigate risk. And like I've said in previous shows, I mean, we meet with our agents every week. We're always kind of mindful about potential red flags, potential risks to mitigate problems. But then, of course, the other process is, if there is an issue with a transaction, well, how do we deal with it the best we can? So you want to make sure you're interviewing people to make sure that the person who's representing you is going to be the right person to help you and to mitigate your risk on the one hand, and obviously help you if things get a little bit problematic. And it doesn't happen that often. I can't say we've had too many, even in our office, too many deals that go wrong or have major issues, but sometimes it does that are out of our control. So always invest the time, interview people. And, of course, going forward, I'll do my best to answer the questions that we get in a general sense, but I can't really obviously kind of help in people's specific situations.
All right, thanks, John. And if people do want to meet with you and your team at Realosophy to discuss a real estate situation in more detail, the link for that is in the show notes as well. So there is that opportunity, obviously, if you're not already working with somebody.
Exactly.
All right, let's move on to our questions for today. Question number one. Hi, John and Urmi. I appreciate your show and the content you create. I have a question about garden suites. As you know, Laneway homes and more recently garden suites have been permitted in Toronto for the last number of years. Is there a sufficient track record to suggest that the construction of a garden suite will increase the value of your home equivalent to its construction cost? I realize this would vary depending on location, suite design, but it would be helpful to know if it generally improves the value immediately or requires holding on to the home and suite for a longer time to extract its expense. Your thoughts on this would be greatly appreciated. Thank you, Danielle.
That's a great question. So, I mean, for those who are not familiar, the City of Toronto and a number of other municipalities, quite frankly, in Southern Ontario, have started legalizing garden suites, which are effectively like a separate home in the backyard of your existing home. And generally, they're much smaller. They're intended to be, a fraction of the square footage of the main home. But we're finding a lot of people do them for multi-generational living. If you have a family member and they, want them to live close to you, but not in the same home, you build a garden suite, they stay there. Some people use them as an investment to rent them out. So it's a good question. And then similarly in Toronto, we're seeing uh, very similar to garden suites. So garden suites are typically homes that have, regular lots, private driveways, things like that. Whereas laneway homes are typically in more urban areas where the homes don't have private driveways but have a laneway behind them. And you can potentially, in some cases, build a home in the laneway, basically in the backyard. So, a great question on sort of the return on investment on these types of properties. So, I mean, it's hard to give concrete numbers, but generally, I mean, most improvements do not return you what you've invested. And it doesn't really matter what kind of renovation you're doing. Like, unless you're a contractor doing it for cost, if you are hiring contractors, designers, going through that whole process, hiring people who specialize in this, even if you're doing an interior home reno, gutting your home, doing your bathrooms, fixing your kitchen, whatever, you never get every dollar back out of it, which means if you have $1 million home today and you spend 300,000 renovating it, you rarely are going to be able to get 1.3 million for that home. Like it's just very rare. Certain renovations have a bigger return on investment, typically kitchens and bathrooms. But again, you're never usually getting dollar for dollar on that. The only people who are generally are contractors who do it themselves, usually at a discount because they're not paying, anyone else to do it. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, that you rarely get uh, full money back. And that, I would say, the case even in the best case scenario with garden suites. If you're spending $500,000 to build a garden suite, it's unlikely you're going to get all of that back if you're going to sell it tomorrow. So I would definitely not do that if you're trying to sell your home and get more money. Now, beyond just the fact that you may not get dollar for dollar back, like it's terrible to do big renovations when you're selling your home. Like even if it's a kitchen or bathroom, like we would never recommend that. But there are a few other things to keep in mind with garden suites that add actually will play a role in how much of a return you're going to get on it. And sometimes, in some cases, you might get very little, right? So let's just use a simple example. If you have a home with whatever it is, like a 40-foot wide lot, but it's very deep, like it's 150 feet deep. Okay. And for the average person who doesn't know, that's a relatively deep lot in a city like Toronto or in the suburbs. You might see more typically homes that are 100 feet deep, right? That are, big enough for a home and a nice backyard, right? Now, if you're 150 feet deep, it's a pretty massive backyard, right? So if I have a 150-foot lot and I'm putting an accessory dwelling in the back of it, um, that's a very different scenario than if I have a 100-foot lot and I'm putting an accessory dwelling in my backyard. Okay, because here's the way to think about it. If I have a 100-foot lot and I'm now putting a secondary home in my backyard, it means I'm largely losing my backyard, right? I end up having like a tiny little patio space potentially, and then what used to be my backyard is now a second home, right? And that is a completely different scenario when compared to if I have a very deep lot and I'm putting an accessory dwelling in the back of it. Like that extra 50 feet doesn't add as much value to the home as like the first 100 feet, right? So if I put a home in the deep end of the lot, I can still have, as the principal residence, a decent sized backyard while having an accessory dwelling in the back, right? So if I'm building an accessory dwelling on a very deep lot, it does not impact the resale value as much because the principal residence will still have a private backyard for the most part, right? Whereas if I only have a 100-foot lot and I put an accessory dwelling in my backyard, well, the person who's buying that home tomorrow is going to have to be fine with not really having a backyard, like having a little patio space. And they're going to have to want to be a landlord or to be have a multi-generational home, right? So in that sense, sometimes if you're building it on a small lot, you're going to get a far less of a return on an investment. You know, in some ways it's kind of like a pool, right? Like if you think about it, like some people love pools, some people don't like pools, right? But pools generally don't add much to the value of a home because, again, like the people who don't want them are just generally not interested in them and don't want to go through the headache of getting rid of it, right? And you could be in a similar situation with an accessory dwelling like a garden suite if you build it in the backyard of a small lot, because there's going to be far fewer people who are like, and let's just if we just use a theoretical example of like that home without the garden suite is worth $1 million, right? And I put in 400,000 to build a garden suite, or 500,000. Well, is someone now going to want to pay me 1.4, 1.5 million for a similar home, but the yard now is like a tiny patio, but I get this benefit of this accessory dwelling? Some people are not going to want to pay the premium for that because they would rather just have a bigger backyard and spend 500,000 less, right? So I think that's a good example of situations where you might not get as big of a return because you're having a negative impact on sort of the principal residents of the home, right? And in some cases with garden suites or laneway homes, for example, if you're building them and you're actually eliminating parking, well, not only is the backyard, say, of the home a little bit smaller, but now you've lost your parking spot. So again, these are sort of things that pull the value down, all else equal, which has a negative impact. So I think you just need to be very mindful of the fact that sometimes when you add an accessory dwelling, it can kind of a negative impact on the home as well. It's not all positive. Like, especially if someone wants it as a principal resident, going to live in the main home, they might want parking, they might want a yard. And the fact that it's gone now because there's an apartment in the backyard is not going to be a big benefit to them. So it's going to be a bit of a niche sale where some people really like it and will pay a bit more, others will not. I hope that was a long-winded answer, but I don't know if all that made sense.
No, I think that was very helpful. I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of this, when I look at something that I would really love to see in a home,
Mm-hmm.
a garden suite, in my estimation would be great because I'm always thinking about other family members who may in the future need help or whatever. It's so easy to assume, oh, this solves everyone's problem. You're not
Mm-hmm.
thinking about a young family with young kids who would
Yeah.
actually just prefer the backyard space. So,
And
um,
not to be a landlord, right?
yes,
Like there's a
and
lot of
yes,
people who
and
just
not
don't.
want someone else who's not part of their family living on the property if they
Exactly.
have
Yeah.
those small kids. So it is interesting. And that's the whole thing with pools, right? A
Hmm.
swimming pool is great for some people, but a lot of people see them as dangerous hazards and
Yeah.
actually find them, don't want it at all. So very good analogy. Thank you. I hope that helped, Danielle.
And I'll just wrap up by saying I think the key thing to keep in mind is that people who are doing this generally, I'm finding, are not doing it strictly for return on investment. Like, yes, you should sell for a little bit more in the future if you sold it tomorrow. You're not going to get all that money back. But most people who are doing them are not doing them for that purpose. Like, they're doing them because usually they need it for themselves, like I said, for like a multi-generational home or something like that. So if you're doing it purely as an investment, you need to really think a little bit harder. You know, some people might pump you up and say this is great and it's going to add to the value, but you need to be critical because a lot of people have their own biases, and you might be spending money that you're not getting back. So if it's strictly as an investment, you want to be cautious of that.
All right, let's get on to our second question. Hi, John. I have been following your content for a while now and appreciate your insights. I have a question regarding vendor take-back mortgages and if you
Mhm.
think this is a good path forward. Now, John, before I continue with this question, because it has a lot of details, I think here it would be useful if you could explain to us what a vendor take-back mortgage is before I
Yeah.
continue.
I mean, that's a term we don't really hear very often. We have not heard very often, especially for residential. It's more common with commercial. So the idea with a vendor take back mortgage is that the seller uh, is not just the seller of the property, but also to some extent the bank as well, right? So let's just say if we just try to keep things simple, um, someone wants to buy a 1.5 million dollar home that I have, right? and the buyer is putting down 500,000 when they need $1 million mortgage. Well, if I don't need the cash and I don't have a mortgage of my own, I can basically, as the seller, say, listen, I'll finance the property. I'll give you the mortgage. You owe me $1 million at X interest rate. And after 3 years, you're going to have to refinance and pay me the money back. But for 3, 4, 5 years or whatever, I'm just going to lend you the money. Right. And that will, or the flip side is you can do it 50-50, where we would say, okay, I'll lend the buyer 500,000, but the other 500,000 you got to go to a regular bank, right? And a lot of times we would like this would happen in commercial transactions. Like one of the earliest deals I did was a VTB deal, like 20 plus years ago. And it was interesting because we gave the purchaser a VTB, so we were basically the seller. And they're very common in commercial transactions. Sometimes when buyers have a bit of a trickier time getting financing, and we can give them a vendor take back oftentimes at a better interest rate if we're not eager for the money than the bank will, to make the deal work for the purchaser, right? So they'll get 500,000 from their regular bank at 7%, and we'll give them 500,000 for 3 years or whatever at 3%, and that's just whatever part of our financing arrangements. So that's basically what a vendor takeback is. It's not very common on residential transactions, but it does happen now and again on residential, but more often on commercial.
All right, so let's continue with this scenario.
Mhm.
My wife and I are renting a 2-bedroom freehold townhouse in Georgetown in the Halton region for $2,600 a month. The landlord now wants to sell. He has offered to sell us the place for $750,000 with a closing date in November, so we will hopefully be at a lower interest rate by then. He is also offering to hold a $350,000 mortgage for 1 year at 2% interest only. So that, John, is the vendor take back mortgage there.
Yeah.
We currently have a down payment of $75,000. Our combined yearly income before taxes is $185,000. We have a dog, 1 kid, and a second on the way in August. There is actually nowhere to rent right now in our town. We are trying to decide if we try to find a 3-bedroom townhouse to rent until we can purchase one when rates are lower in 1 to 2 years, so we get the number of bedrooms we actually want, or if we agree to our landlord's offer and make this smaller house work with 2 kids sharing a bedroom for a couple of years. Do you think the landlord's offer is a good deal, or should we hold up for a place we can stay long-term in for 5 to 10 years? Any advice you have would be greatly appreciated. Thanks, Yannick.
That's a good question. There's so many things there. So,
Mm-hmm.
I
A
mean,
lot of details.
yeah, I mean, even though the question started off with asking whether a vendor take back mortgage is a good deal, I think that is almost like the last thing they should be thinking about. Because how you finance a property is, again, like what you sort out after you've decided whether you even want to buy it, whether if the price is right, whether you want to be there for X number of years. And, based on the email and the questions, I mean, to me, it sounds like I wouldn't do it. Like, and again, this is a personal bias, so take it with a grain of salt. But I think my point is that you don't want to be buying a home, even if it's from your landlord or whatever, that's only going to fit your needs for 2 years. Like, it's generally not a good rule of thumb is to buy a home that you can settle into for at least 5 years, right? Because there are transaction costs, like there's all sorts of things involved. So generally, you don't want to be buying a property, even if it's off market through your landlord, if you're just going to have to move again in 2 years. So my instinct is I probably would not do that. I would focus on, saving money for the home that you can settle into for the longer term, quite frankly. And whatever is involved in potentially buying that home, in your market a year from now or a year and a half from now sounds probably like a better strategy. Obviously it might be, I'm making it sound easier said than done if there's not a lot of rentals in the area, and not a lot of options, but I don't know if like buying a home to get by for a year or two is a good option. You know what I mean? I think I'd be looking for rentals and things like that. So that's the first thing I'd say. I mean, the other, when we think about if it's a good deal, Often with off-market properties, you need to be very careful that you're actually paying a reasonable price. So let's just say, this person decided they wanted to buy it, right? You need to do a little bit more due diligence to make sure the 750 works for you, right? And it is a reasonable price, and you're not overpaying and things like that. So I'd say that's the second consideration. And then the final consideration is how to finance it, right? And this kind of is where we start talking about the VTB and whether that's worth it. And the challenge with, the VTB, the vendor take back mortgage is, and I can't remember if it was in the question, but you're going to have fewer options in terms of institutions that will finance that, because what happens is the bank or credit union or whatever going has you typically like the first mortgage on the property, right? And then the vendor, and you need to sort those, has a second mortgage effectively, right? So if you're buying for 750, you're putting 10% down. Whatever bank you go to or credit union is going to finance, say, a $325,000 worth of the mortgage. The seller is going to finance 350, right? And this is a good example where sometimes it seems like a deal because it said not only are they paying 2% for that 350, that's the vendors, they're only paying interest, right? Which makes your cash flow look a lot better. But again, this is just like a short-term teaser, right? Where your payments are kind of artificially low for 1 year only because you only have to pay interest on the 350 and not principal, and you're only paying 2%. So you would want to look at what the costs are if you're paying sort of the full mortgage to make sure you can even afford it, because they're paying 2,600 now. If they went and got a mortgage, I mean, their mortgage is going to be over 4 grand alone on that property. Like, assuming they got a mortgage for the full amount, right? Not this teaser rate, not this VTB. So you want to make sure that those costs work. The other thing is I actually, I wonder how it would work with CMHC, because they have less than 20% down. And I don't know the answer to this, quite frankly. I haven't, it's kind of a bit of a unique situation. But typically, if you have less than 20% down, you need to get mortgage insurance in Canada, right? And either through CMHC or one of the private mortgage insurers. Um, and I wonder how they deal with that when you're getting a vendor take back mortgage and if that impacts it at all. And I don't know the answer to that. You'd want to talk to a mortgage broker to see how that impacts it. And I'm rambling, but the last thing I'll say is, when you're getting your mortgage today, if you have like a 1 year vendor take back, you just got to be mindful of the fact that, well, now a year from now, you're going to have to go back potentially to your existing lender, and then get a proper mortgage for that extra 350, right? So it's a little bit of a process, and maybe all of that stuff is worth it if they were buying a home that they'd settle into for 5+ years, right? I mean, I don't know if doing all of these, unique financing arrangements is worth doing for a home that you might want to sell in a couple of years, personally.
All right, thanks, John. It sounds like if renting the right size home is challenging, maybe the compromise is to make do with a smaller place
Yeah, in the short term.
in short
Yeah,
term,
yeah, exactly.
from what you're suggesting. So think of it that way, rather than this. I guess it seems like you're passing up an opportunity sometimes when you're offered these.
Sometimes it feels like that, exactly. And I think people feel like they have an opportunity, they get off market, they don't have to go to bidding wars, they don't have to, you know what I mean? But you gotta make sure it is an opportunity, right? The value's there, it fits your needs for the long term. And if it doesn't, they're better off just going to another 2 bedroom rental, and maybe that's even better than getting a 3 bedroom rental. You save some money for your down payment. Your rent's going to be lower for 2 years. So they can buy sooner rather than later.
Yeah, maybe that's a compromise
Yeah.
solution there. Okay, well, thank you. There were a lot of details, but actually you did a great job of unpacking all of that. Okay, so we're going to move on to our question 3. Hi, John. You guys are doing a bang up job, so thanks for that. I have a couple of questions as I will be taking possession of a pre-condo construction after many delays and have been thrust into the position of an investor. This would have been my principal residence, except things changed over the pandemic, and I ended up purchasing a home with my partner. There was a lot of press about high interest rates putting off investors, especially for condos. Perhaps you can explain how mortgage interest rates and fees are tax deductible to help offset this burden. Can I contribute rental income to my RRSP to further reduce my tax load for each year as long as I have the room? Do you have any tips for others like myself who originally intended to reside in a property but are now faced with either having to rent it out or sell it? As for selling it, although the unit has appreciated some $80,000 to $90,000 over 5 years, I understand that assignment sales are difficult. So it appears that becoming a landlord for a few years appears to be the more viable option, considering rental demand is reasonably good in my North York neighborhood. I appreciate your guidance, Carlos. John, again, a few
Yes.
terms that you'll have to unpack for us, like assignment sales.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just start with that before we kind of get into some of the tax questions. So, you know, this is someone, of course, who bought a property. They were planning on moving into it. It's scheduled for completion. So if you're trying to sell the property before you've taken ownership, so you just have the pre-construction contract, what you're effectively doing is assigning the contract. You're not selling the property because you don't own it yet. So this is what they mean, this Carlos means by an assignment sale. So these are tough transactions to do in this market. You cannot advertise them on the MLS for the most part. They're sort of behind the scenes off, different Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups. Like realtors find other ways to market them. But it's generally a tough market to be selling an assignment property in this market. So this is why.
And John, is that because that's a builder stipulation because they don't want
Yes.
these units to hit the market when they themselves are still selling units? Or like when does this situation come up? Because presumably there is a point at which the building's fully completed and you
Mhm.
could sell a condo on the MLS, like as a resale
Yes.
property.
So this happens before you've taken ownership of it. Like maybe you're occupying it because, tall building, the lower level units will occupy, which means that the, unit owner has to effectively pay like what is effectively like rent until they take ownership. But they don't own the property. So during the occupancy period, when they don't own it, the builder generally doesn't want anyone selling because the builder has their own inventory on the market and they don't want to be competing with the people who bought on, pre-construction. And they don't want the people who bought pre-construction to be unloading them at a discount on the MLS, which would make it harder for them to get the price that they want, right? So this is why a lot of times they put these rules in that you can't advertise it because they don't want it to impact what they're selling for, right? They don't want to be competing with investors. Once you've closed on the property, which means you've paid your fees, you paid your land transfer tax, you got your mortgage, you are the registered owner, yeah, you can sell it, right? But a lot of times people are trying to assign to avoid paying those additional costs, right? Because that adds to your transaction costs. If you've just paid all of these closing fees, and that's going to add to your transaction costs. And this is why a lot of people try to sell before that. But it is a tough market. So this person sounds like they're planning on taking possession. And they're trying to sort of understand how to manage sort of the income and taxes. So I reached out to tax specialists, tax lawyers, Kyle Lamoth from Thorstenson's firm. If you need their website is actually just thor.ca, which is pretty easy to remember. So you can check them out. One of their partners is very active on Twitter, but Kyle was kind of generous enough to share some feedback and we'll have the contact info in the show notes as well on how to approach this. So, the first thing he said when we spoke was that the best way to think about this, if you're an investor with a condo, is that it's like you're starting a small business, right? And you got to look at, of course, what your gross income is, and as the reader question said, you're deducting your expenses, right? So you're going to be deducting your mortgage interest as an expense, but not your principal, right? So you're not deducting the full mortgage payment because the mortgage payment includes interest and principal, and the principal is not deductible. So only the interest is. And of course, any other fees, insurance, condo fees, property tax, maintenance costs, all of those things are generally can be deducted from your gross income each year. He also mentioned that you could technically depreciate the value of the condo if you still have profit at the end of the year, right? So if your income exceeds your expenses, you could potentially do that as well. And then you're basically filing that on your income tax return. You're going to basically look at that sort of rental income. You're going to deduct your expenses, and that sort of gets added to your gross rental income for the year. Now, the question about can you add your rental income to your RSP? And Kyle mentioned that a couple of things to keep in mind. That first is it's not a good way to think about it, like taking your rental income, adding it to your RSP. It's almost like you look at what your rental income is, you deduct the expenses, this gets added to your gross rental income, right? And certainly any portion of your gross rental income you can use to apply to sort of your RRSP room to deduct your total taxable income. However, if you have RSP room, however, he said that the rental income doesn't give you additional RSP room, right? So if you have generally RSP room and you want to take and you've netted after all your expenses, you netted say $10,000 in rental income. If you want to dump that into your RSP, all the power to you. But again, part of this for some people is just having the cash flow to do that, right? Because some of these gains that you make, some of this profit you make is not cash in your pocket because part of this is, of course, like principal repayment, right? So even though you're making money on paper, it doesn't mean you're making that in your pockets to pay down or contributes to your RSP, if that makes sense, right? It's not like you're getting that in cash. So you would need to have the cash to do that if you wanted to do that. And that's an important consideration if you're doing that. So I think that covered most of the questions. So in short, yeah, you're running it like like a small business. You're deducting your expenses. It does not add to your RSP room, but you can, reduce your tax burden by contributing to your RSP, provided you have the cash and the means to do that. And I think that kind of answered most of the questions that we had.
Great. Well, thank you, John. Hopefully, I think Yannick found that helpful. I certainly learned a bit there too. So I think that takes us to the end of the show. As always, I'd like to thank everyone for watching. And if you find our show useful, please subscribe, like, or leave us a positive review on YouTube or whatever podcast platform you're accessing us from. We really appreciate your support of our show. And I guess, John, all we need to do now is say thanks for watching, and
Yes,
we'll be back answering your questions next month.
absolutely. Keep the questions coming in. You can send them at askjohn@movesmartly.com, and we'll see everybody next month.